Solitary by Robert Silverberg, narrated by Mike Vendetti. Crime analyses were handled by Totovac, which could handle and intelligize more data in microseconds than a human being could in hours. But the trouble was that when Totovac indicated, for example, that no one would try to hide on Belarus 4, a world devoid of all life, it only meant that such a notion would be illogical, and since all the logical places for the escaped convict Charcot to hide had been covered. Ever since the computers came to be running things pretty much their own way, handling data and forming conclusions, the only way a man could achieve any notice in the galaxy was to do some original thinking. And by original, read alogical. An analog computer is a clever thing, with its countless supercooled Cyrotons clicking off bits of information. But its mind is a limited sort of creature. Men, luckily, aren't limited to the flip-flop, on-off type of binary thinking that the computers specialize in. Among those most painfully aware of this was George Brower of Crime Bureau, because the job of keeping data on the galaxy's criminals was so complex. Crime Bureau was among the first to be completely computerized. Its employees were reduced to the level of data prodigitators, selecting information to be programmed and fed to the computers. As the centuries passed, the human members of Crime Bureau became less and less necessary to the scheme of things. They were more adjutants to the Totovac that did the actual work. This irked George Brower. At 31, he felt he was at a crossroads. This was his 5th year with Crime Bureau, and in those 5 years he had become an increasingly more skillful computer technician. Nothing more. This was not why he had joined Crime Bureau. He had been interested, being a serious, reflective man, in the concept of crime and punishment, the philosophical determinants of guilt, mores and ethos, responsibility and necessary obligation. They fascinated him. "You ought to join Crime Bureau," his college roommate told him sourly. "Always talking about murders and things, as if you were going to commit a couple." "It's purely a scholarly interest," Brower said, and when he graduated he joined Crime Bureau. At 31 he was at a crossroads. Moodily he sat at his furnished Duroplast desk in the magnificent Crime Bureau Ministry in Upper Ontario, toying with the sheets of paper before him. They listed statistics governing occurrence of voyeurism on Earth and on the 17 norm planets used as guideposts in such things. Brower was supposed to integrate them, feed them to omnivorous Totovac, and wait while the statistics came rattling back, neatly interpreted. They were to be transmitted to Lunar 9, an Earth-type planet, affected simultaneously with a rash of voyeurism and with a starchily puritanical ruling oligarchy, for benefit of the bemused and troubled chief of police there. As he worked, Brower found himself envying that chief of police, stranded on a backwater world, as he was. At least, the man had a chance to deal with crime and criminals firsthand, not with the ever-present Totovac peering over his shoulder. Brower plodded gloomily through the long columns, then sent the whole tape whirring into the innards of the computer. Pulses flitted down tantalum triatons. Information was bandied and conclusions drawn, and Brower ground his fist into his chin in boredom. The computer took all the trial and error out of things. To be sure, Totovac operated on a trial and error system itself, as did any analog computer. But the interval between successive trials was often less than a microsecond, and a speed of that order allowed for all the wrong guesses a machine would be likely to make in a 2-minute span. 2 minutes. The data came chittering back at him. Without even looking at it, Brower tossed it in the upper basket on his desk. Stultification. That was the word. A man had to do a little thinking on his own. It was all right to use the computer as a tool to simplify the process of thought, but not as a substitute for it. On a sudden impulse, he stuck a requisition form in his typewriter, which was an old, antiquated manual model, and tapped out a brief message. Send me data cards on current file of unsolved crimes. He glanced at what he had written, scowled, and added for benefit of the computer, time limitation, last 30 years. Space limitation, this galaxy. Brower paused, then tacked on a second postscript. Hop to it, or I'll put ketchup in your feed lines. He integrated the requisition form and shot it downward into Todovac's bowels. An instant later, the red light over his desk blazed, indicating a message from the computer, and the machine replied, Coercion invalidates requisition. Please delete same or face penalty. Brower could imagine the storm his whimsical threat had kicked up down in the defensive banks of the computer. Probably they were busy monitoring the cooling system, the fuel input, and anything else that might be construed as a feed line, on guard for a sudden influx of ketchup. Coercion deleted, he replied. No danger of destruction by ketchup. The warning light blinked out. The computer's hackles were subsiding. Moments later came a deluge. He had asked for the current file of unsolved cases. He got it. It came spilling out of the computer's orifice with a rush and a roar, card after card, covered with Todovac's neat typing. Brower blinked as the cards piled up. There were a lot of people in the galaxy, and a great many crimes, and if just a few, a bare fraction, went unsolved. He sighed. There was no way to interrupt the machine, now that it had begun to disgorge. The computer was reaching into the depths of its files, coming up with cases that had been on the books for decades. At least 5,000 cards were on the desk now, and they still came. The communicator chimed. Brower grabbed it and heard his superior bark. "Brower, what are you doing?" "Original research, Chief," he said smoothly. "The machine's a little over-enthusiastic, that's all." "Oh, research on what?" "I'd prefer not to talk about it until I'm finished. I may need a short leave of absence, too." "I suppose it can be arranged," the chief said gruffly, and broke the contact. Brower stared balefully at the mounting stack of cards. All right. He had announced he was working on something. Now he would have to follow through. Second stack of 5,000 cards had appeared, and it seemed as if the computer was well on its way toward delivering a third, when abruptly a single card fluttered out of the orifice, and the message light flashed. Brower snatched up the communication. "End of immediate access open files. There will be delay of 180 seconds while secondary files are searched." "No, there won't," Brower half shouted. Quickly he pecked out a reply. "Data already delivered is sufficient for a project. Terminate search without further activity." A pause, then the response. "Acknowledged. Terminated." "Thank goodness," Brower said fervently. He stared at the heaps of data cards in a somewhat glassy-eyed manner, feeling like the sorcerer's apprentice. But at least he had managed to shut off the flow. He lifted the uppermost card and skimmed it. Tall, thin Syrian, suspected of shoplifting in third city of Vega 4, 29.9 years before. Never apprehended. Further details other side. Second card was even less promising. Child's pet stolen by large hairy man on morning of 7 July 2561. Planet Earth. Pet never recovered. Details other side. The card had been in the files 30 years. Someone could gain more than a little prestige, Bauer thought, simply by clearing junk like this out of the memory banks. By now the stolen pet, unless it had been a Galapagos turtle, was long since dead, and the bereaved child grown to manhood. And yet the crime was still carried as unsolved. He reached for a third card. Like the first two, it dated back 30 years, but it was considerably more interesting. Brower read it once functionally, then went back and examined it in detail. Charcot, Edward Hammond, born 21 December 2530, New York City, Earth, Sol 3. Criminal record, petty theft, apprehended 8 November 2547, corrective term 1 month. Released for good behavior. Kidnapping, apprehended 12 January 2558. Escaped from custody 17 January 2558. Relocated 11 June 2559. Concluded 4 October 2559. Trial began 18 June, correctory. Transshipped to Procyon 4, 7 November 2559. Entered upon life term 11 January 2560. Escape from Procyon Correctory 12 May 2560. Still at large. See additional datasheet 101 in request file. Brower flexed the card between two fingers and dug back in his memory. A memory not nearly as retentive as Todovac's, but unusually good as mere organic ones went. He was investigating the data stored away in his youth, in his period of greatest criminological enthusiasm, before the disillusionment of joining Crime Bureau. Edward Charcot. Yes, he remembered Charcot, even though the case had been most notorious only a month or two after Brower's birth. Charcot had been a cheap criminal, a petty hood of the sort that no amount of careful breeding seemed likely ever to eradicate from human genetic lines. He had committed a particularly vicious kidnapping 30-odd years ago, and he had been caught. And unless Brower's memory was at fault, he was to date the only man ever to break out of the Procyon Correctory. With nervous haste, he shoved the umpteen thousand data cards back into the computer's orifice and punched out a new requisition. Send additional data sheet 101 on Charcot, Edward Hammond. Moments later the sheet arrived. To his satisfaction, Brower saw he had been right. Charcot's notoriety was based on the fact that he was the only man ever to escape from Procyon's airtight correctory. He had stolen a one-man warship somehow and struck out for points unknown before anyone knew he was missing. One of the minor mysteries of the case was how Charcot had managed to escape, but since no one before or since had succeeded in getting off Procyon 4, it was considered that the experiment was non-repeatable. The major mystery was Charcot's whereabouts. The data sheet listed all reports, reliable and otherwise, of his location. He had been seen, or half seen, at a dozen places radiating in a more or less straight line out toward the region of Bellatrix, and there the trail vanished. A sporadic search of the 6 planets of Bellatrix had revealed nothing. Thoughts tumbled through Brower's mind. Who Edward Charcot was didn't much matter, nor the fact that Charcot had humiliated the penologist by getting out in an escape-proof correctory. Not that he was responsible for a fairly ghastly crime. No. He had disappeared, though, and that offended Brower's sense of order. In a galaxy so carefully regulated by analog computers, men didn't disappear, at least not easily. Of course, this Charcot was a clever chap, obviously, but still, where could he have gone? The trail led toward Bellatrix and its system. Brower licked his lips reflectively. A major attempt had no doubt been made toward finding Charcot. It had failed. Why? Some deficiency inherent in the nature of the pursuit, no doubt. Brower's pulse rate started climbing. Here was a chance for original research. Here was a chance for an ordinary flesh-and-blood man with a built-in capacity for making cockeyed guesses to show up a billion-unit cryotonic computer with its deplorable binary way of thinking. He decided to find Edward Charcot. The first step was to activate the communicator. "Chief, this is Brower. I want to request a 3-month leave from duty." "With or without pay?" Brower hesitated, then boldly say, "With. It's to do that special research job I was talking about." There was a pause. 3 months with pay? It may be rough on our budget, George. Can you tell me anything about the research? "I'm going to find Edward Charcot," Brower said. The reaction was predictable. "Who?" "Charcot, the kidnapper who escaped from Procyon Correctory in 2560. Remember?" "Oh, that one. All right. Fill out the form, integrate it yourself, and feed it to the machine. You know how to do it. I'll see to it your leave is approved." Brower rapidly integrated the leave request and let Totovac of it. Then he formulated a new requisition. "Send all data available on Charcot, Edward Hammond." Moments later he had it, including duplicates of the data card and additional datasheet 101. The machine was damnably literal about all data requests. Brower cleared his desk and proceeded to examine the information. Most of it was a repetition of what he had already learned. He skimmed through that, and also through most of Charcot's biography. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in the post-escape part of the data, including the packet where transcripts of statements by men who had already seen Charcot, or thought they had, in one guise or another after his much-publicized escape. Someone, Brower hoped it was a man, and not a watchful facet of Totovac, had charted a probability pattern with each report of Charcot carefully linked in according to a weighted color spectrum of credibility, ranging from bright cerise for fairly reliable down to dark violet for totally untrustworthy. The color chart led undeniably toward Bellatrix, and appended to the packet was a report of the scouting mission that had searched the area for Charcot. Apparently Totovac had analyzed the 6 planets of Bellatrix and had concluded that Charcot would be on either Bellatrix 2, 3, or 6, all of which were inhabited by reasonably docile forms of intelligent life. Scout ship CD-102-X3 had diligently searched Bellatrix 2, 3, and 6. There had been no sign of Charcot, whereupon The trail having trickled out, the Charcot file had been dumped into the unsolved, and probably had mouldered there unmolested until Brower's requisition had released it. Humming gently to himself, Brower rummaged through the rest of the packet. Included was a Teleflex sheet, now somewhat yellowed with age, dated 12 May 2560. Project of origin, Procyon 4. It showed a photo of the escaped. He was a darkly handsome, almost suave-looking man, Brower noted, with a faint mustache, deep-set eyes, a smirk rather than a smile on his lips. Shrewd man, Brower decided, even though it was an elementary rule of criminology to place little weight upon superficialities of appearance. Yet in Charcot's case, his actions bore out the testimony of his features. It took a shrewd man to get out of Peyton's correctory. The Teleflex sheet went on to mention the reward offered for information leading to Charcot's recovery, described him, gave a brief biography. Doubtless there were still some of those sheets mounted on post-office walls in obscure parts of the galaxy, Brower thought. He put the Teleflex sheet back in the file packet and restored the other materials as well. He dumped it all into the receiving orifice. Send data on the Bellatrix system. He ordered the computer. Bellatrix was a star of magnitude plus 1.7, located 215 light-years from Earth. Relative to Earth, it was located in the constellation Orion, but of course, visual proximity from an external point had nothing to do with actual three-dimensional location in the universe. According to the data Brunner had, Bellatrix had a planetary system comprising 6 worlds. Bellatrix 1 was 500 million miles from its blazing primary, and the other 5 planets were arrayed in normally distributed orbits up to a distance of 3 billion miles. Brower quickly ran through the survey reports on the 6 worlds. Bellatrix 1 was uninhabited and uninhabitable. It took a regular roasting from the sun and had a mean temperature of about 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Bellatrix 2 was inhabited. It was a watery world, the water, however, in actuality being a mixture of liquefied halogens. The natives were amiable chlorine breathers, whose hide resisted etching by the lakes of hydrogen fluoride common on the planet. Bellatrix 3 was likewise inhabited. This was a large, low-mass world peopled by ruminant herbivores, 4-legged but intelligent. The record showed a Terran settlement in operation there. Brower continued to read. Bellatrix 4 and 5 were both uninhabited. 4 was a rocky, unappealing world with a scant population of lichens and nothing else. Life had simply not yet gained a foothold there. 5 was a gas giant of massive gravitational attraction. Its surface was uninhabitable, and explorers had deemed it unwise to land. As for Bellatrix 6, it was an Earth-type world, somewhat colder on the mean, inhabited by humanoid creatures just entering the food-producing stage of culture. The scouts had recommended a closed status for this world, for fear of upsetting the normal development of the expanding culture. The closure had been approved. Brower had studied the report of the search once again. He was not surprised to read Todovac's evaluation of Charcot's possible whereabouts. Bellatrix 6, being a closed world, was the most likely place for a callous criminal to hide, since there was little chance of his discovery on a closed world. Therefore, 6 had to be the prime target of the researchers. After that came 3, since it was a livable and inhabited world. Further down the scale of probability was 2, the water world where an Earthman could manage to survive, if properly protected. The other 3 worlds had been rather casually dismissed. 5, The gas giant was eliminated completely, since it was impossible to survive long on a world without a solid surface. One, with its temperature at 300 degrees, was docketed for only a cursory once-over, since it, too, was hardly promising as a hideout for an escaped criminal. As for Bellatrix 5, the utterly barren world, it was likewise dealt off by the computer with a mere once-over. After all, it was illogical that a fleeing man would choose to settle, even for a few days, on a world devoid of all life. Brower chuckled happily as he read Todovac's solemn conclusion. Illogical indeed. Sure, it was illogical, but all that meant that no self-respecting computer would ever choose to hide there. Happily, Brower put away his data, confirmed his leave, and arranged for transportation. He requisitioned a one-man cruiser equipped with warp drive and plenty of charts. He was heading for Bellatrix. Just before he left, he requisitioned the data file on Charcot once again to check something. Yes, the reward was $50,000. He wondered if it still stood after these 30 years. Even by warp drive, 215 light-years takes a while to traverse. Brower spent the time pleasantly reading his collection of classics. Braden, Fell, Staub, and Alexander. Carol Chessman, Horsfall, and Wagley. They were part of his prized collection of 20th and 21st century criminology. Back then, he thought a man had a chance to use his wits, not simply punch data in or out of a bunch of critons. Crime, after all, was an irrational manifestation. It was foolish, then, to depend wholly on an inflexibly rational binary-oriented mind, or pseudo-mind, to make the top-level decisions. Take this business of Bellatrix, he thought. The silly search over areas carefully pre-selected by Todovac. Had any of the searchers bothered to deviate from the prescribed pattern? Probably not. And if they had, they probably had decided it would be unsafe to report such actions to the computer. He emerged from warp uncomfortably close to Bellatrix himself. Brower was not an experienced spaceman by any means, but a warship was a simple device to operate. It had a built-in safety control that saw to it that its operator could do no wrong. In the event of a materialization of an impossible place, such as within a planet, no paradox would result. The ship would simply and swiftly demolecularize itself. In the event of a crash landing, the ship was equipped with a device that would automatically radiate a distress pulse on a wideband carrier that could be picked up anywhere within a radius of 20 light-years. He popped back into normal space, not far from Bellatrix 1, which happened to be at Aphelion. Just as well, he decided. Even 500 million miles from Bellatrix was too close to suit him. Brower had a definite plan of actions which called for a speedy survey of the 6 planets, more to familiarize himself with the territory than anything else, and then a fine-toothing of his 2 prime suspects. He therefore brought the ship into a close orbit around Bellatrix 1 for his first look-see, and it was fairly evident that if Charcot had landed here, he had not survived. Bellatrix 1 was similar in general appearance to the dayside of Sol 1. Its baked, blistered surface was airless and lifeless. Shimmering pools of metal lay on the sands as on Mercury. Here, though, there was no dark side and no merciful twilight belt for an escaped convict to settle in. Bellatrix 1 rotated quite nicely on its axis, presenting each hemisphere in turn to the sun. Brower moved on. Bellatrix 1 held little promise. He approached 3 next, since 2 was currently at the far end of its orbit. 3 was the low-mass world dominated by herbivores. Brower allowed himself an amused chuckle at the thought of the ecology prof, who had gravely assured him that such a situation was impossible. He scouted low. No signs of human inhabitation. Of course, on a quick buzz like Todovac had directed them to search 2, 3, and 7. He was willing to assume they had done it properly. The other 3 planets were different matters. Brower took an interested look at Bellatrix 2, moved on, buzzed Baron 4, circled 6, and doubled back to 5. As he had been warned, and as he expected, it was impossible, or at least certainly risky, to get too close to Mighty 5. A landing was out of the question. Having been through the entire system, Brower now drew back, locked the ship in a stable orbit, and pacing the cabin began to develop hypotheses. The computer, he said aloud, somewhat self-consciously, is primarily rational. Having made the quasi-rational deduction that Charcot was somewhere in Bellatrix's system, it must then proceed to eliminate possibilities. 3 of the planets are so unappealing that no man in his right mind would land on them. A 4th, 2, is inhabitable but scarcely satisfactory. The remaining 2 are possible choices for a man looking for a place to hide until the search for him died down. Item: Charcot stole a warp ship. This tells the computer a number of things. One of them is that Charcot must have landed the ship voluntarily and not crash-landed somewhere, because had he crash-landed the ship, it would automatically have sent out distress signals. Since no distress signals were sent out, the ship did not crash-land. Ergo, he either came out of warp in an impossible place and was demolecularized, or he landed safely on one of the inhabited worlds. Probability favors the latter. Therefore, the computer suggested that planets 6, 3, and 2 be searched in that order. Brower smiled. The computer had acted in perfect sanity, with one mistake. It hadn't allowed for the possibility that man might be so demented as to deliberately remove so integral a part of his ship's equipment as the automatic distress signal. It was possible to do so, though inconceivable. But after all, what if Charcot had made a bad landing, crushed a tail fin or 2, and the signal had gone off, bringing half a dozen unwanted patrol ships down on him in a flash? It was possible for Brower to proceed computer fashion from that one illogical postulate, assuming Charcot either landed safely or crash-landed on one of the Bellatrix worlds. Then either he landed safely on one of the 3 habitable worlds, and thus would have been found by Todovac's searchers, or he crash-landed on one of the other 3 planets. Since Charcot had not been found by the Todovac searchers, and since he would not voluntarily have landed on worlds 1, 4, or 5, the conclusion had to be that Charcot had crash-landed on one of those planets. Brower grinned smugly. It was pure deduction, unlike the celebrations of the legendary Mr. Holmes, whose alleged deductions were actually more induction. The only thing that remained was the proof. Brower thought feelingly of the poor dupes feeding into Todovac back there in Upper Ontario. How they would envy him. He readied himself for the search. Here, too, he was able to winnow down his candidates with a little thought. Had Charcot crash-landed on either 1 or 5, the evidence of his presence would long since have been erased by the elements. Furthermore, 5 was impossible for Brower to search. But 4, lonely, barren 4, had Charcot crashed there amid the disinterested lichen, there would still be proof. The wrecked spaceship, tools, perhaps even the body. Brower had the most to gain by Charcot having crashed on 4, and so he chose 4 to begin his search. He expected searching to be a painstaking job. He calculated he could cover the entire landmass of the planet in broad sweeps and do the job properly in a month's time. Brower was a patient man. He had many examples from the past as his guides to criminological technique. No patience was needed, though. Luck, which is often scoffed at, but which is a valid factor in detection, entered here. And 17 hours after his ship had entered the first of its search maneuvers, Brower's elaborate construction of guesswork and deduction was solidified when his mass detectors recorded the presence of a spaceship crumpled on the rocks below. A pulse thundered in his ears as he brought his ship down tenderly on Bellatrix IV's forbidding surface. It was a neat landing. Atmospheric check reported the air breathable, and he rushed from his ship. 100 yards away lay another one-man job, identical to his own. It had struck tail first heavily, toppled, bashed its snout against an outcrop of what looked like dark basalt. Luckily, it had landed hatch upright, so its lone occupant had been able to clamber out. The hatch was open now. Brower approached, looked around for some sign of the skeleton. There was none. Evidently, Charcot had wandered for some distance over the bare, arid world before his food ran out. Brower photographed the ship from several angles, then hoisted himself up and climbed inside. He blinked in surprise. The interior didn't seem to have been empty 30 years. The ship looked lived in. How? Then he saw how. The resourceful Charcot had somehow tucked a Craster food synthesizer away in the ship before blasting off. A man could live a long time with just a food synthesizer. To one side of the machine lay a little heap of crushed rocks. Evidently, Charcot had been feeding rock to the synthesizer's molecular converter, and thus literally living off the planet. Otherwise, the ship was bare. No tapes, no comforts, just a cradle and the synthesizer. Brower lurked around until he had confirmed another of his theories. The distress signal device had been crudely but efficiently ripped loose. He took careful photos, then climbed through the hatch again, and gasped. A thin, ancient-looking figure, bent and angular, with a shaggy yellow-white beard, was staggering across the barren plain toward the ship. Returning from a stole, no doubt. Charcot. It had to be Charcot. 30 years of solitude had left their mark, but behind the dried skin and unkempt beard was still the sharp-eyed face of the shrewd young criminal pictured on the telefax sheet. Half dizzy with incredulity, Brower scrambled down the side of the ship, jumped, felt the impact of the rock jarring his feet, and hesitantly approached the old man. It was not until they were 20 feet apart that the ancient showed any signs of having seen Brower. Suddenly the old man paused, wobbled unsteadily on his feet, raised one gnarled hand, pointed from Brower's ship to Brower. His dry lips worked. A harsh rumbling sound came forth. After much effort, the oldster managed to shape a tremulous word. You. The effort and the shock was too great. He tottered, pivoted wildly, fell forward. Brower was galvanized out of his numbness. He ran to the old man, knelt, slid his hand inside the ragged shirt, felt the bony chest. Silence. The silence of death. Brower's fingers encountered something folded beneath the old man's shirt. With trembling hands he drew it out and examined it. It was tattered, enigmated with age, but still legible. It was a telefax sheet with a photo of the escaped convict. Brower glanced from the smirking, youthful face to the old man's. There was no doubt this was Charcot. Somehow he had clung to life with only the food synthesizer for a companion. He had been totally alone for 30 years, without so much as a book or a pet, on lifeless Bellatrix IV. Brower shuddered. No doubt Charcot had believed he was gaining freedom when he broke out of the Confrectory. But there at last, he had been in humane hands among men who would try to provide some sort of therapy and rehabilitation. Solitary confinement was cruel, barbarous. Penal codes had outlawed it decades earlier. He had trapped himself in a prison without walls. He had lived here 30 years alone. His freedom had in actuality been a punishment more terrible than any court would mete out. The shock of seeing another living human being again had killed him. Broodingly, Brower pocketed the tattered teleflex sheet and kicked away a pebble. Then he shuffled back toward the outjutting hill. There wasn't even any soil on the planet in which to bury Charcot. He began to gather rocks for the old man's cairn. Later, he sub-radioed a simple message to the nearest pickup point for Totevex data collectors. It said, "In the matter of the escape of Charcot, Edward Hammond. The case is closed." This has been Solitary by Robert Silverberg, narrated by Mike Vendetti. Production copyright 2024 by Mike Vendetti Productions. www.mikevendetti.com